Sarah stepped onto the plane, gripping her ticket with slightly sweaty fingers, trying to ignore the weight of the stairs around her. She didn't want to draw attention, didn't seek judgment, she just wanted to go home. But from the moment she crossed the threshold of the aircraft, she sensed something was off. The flight attendant standing near the entrance gave her a quick once-over, her lips stretching into a polite yet strained smile. It was the kind of smile that wasn't about kindness, it was about evaluation, about quiet scrutiny masquerading as professionalism. Sarah had seen it before. A glance that lingered just long enough to make its message clear: you don't belong. Other passengers noticed but looked away just as quickly. An awkward silence filled the cabin, thick and suffocating. She took a steadying breath and forced herself forward. She had no idea that among the passengers on this very flight, someone was watching, someone who was about to change everything. The airport had been the usual mess of hurried travelers, rolling suitcases, and the endless stream of announcements crackling through overhead speakers. Yet Sarah had barely noticed any of it. Her thoughts were tethered to the phone in her hand, her heart pounding as she scrolled anxiously. An unread message from the vet. Her stomach twisted. Toby's results are in. We need to talk as soon as possible. She swallowed hard. Toby, her aging beagle, had been sick for weeks. The vet had promised to send an update before her flight, but this short, ominous text told her everything she needed to know. The news wasn't good. Sarah clenched her jaw, willing the emotions down. Not here. Not now. She took another breath and tucked her phone into her pocket. There were still long hours ahead, and she had to keep it together. She glanced around. Airports weren't new to her, she had traveled alone before. But something about today felt different. The stares weren't just fleeting glances of curiosity. They carried weight. Judgment. A silent question lingering in the air: why is she here? She knew the answer. She always had. Her body had never conformed to society's expectations. She wasn't small, wasn't delicate. She took up space, and that alone seemed to make people uncomfortable. But she had never been the type to shrink herself to fit into the narrow confines of what others deemed acceptable. Her t-shirt was bright pink, with bold white letters that read, "Peace, Love, and Dogs." A statement she truly believed in. But today, even those words felt ironic. The world rarely returned the kindness she tried to put out. A voice interrupted her thoughts: that's a philosophy I live by, too. She looked up, startled. A man stood beside her in the boarding area, his eyes briefly flickering over the words on her shirt. He was casually dressed, with tousled dark hair and an unshaven jaw. Something about his presence was oddly calming. Sarah hesitated before offering a small, tentative smile. Yeah. Seems like a good motto, right? He nodded, the corner of his lips tilting upward in a way that wasn't mocking, just genuine. Before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed again. She glanced down, heart hammering, hoping for another message from the vet, perhaps more clarity, just a flight reminder. By the time she looked back up, the man was gone, lost in the sea of passengers. She exhaled slowly and took a step forward in the boarding line, her mind still half distracted. But then, she felt it. That chill running down her spine. Someone was watching her. A woman, standing by the gate in a crisp flight attendant uniform. Slim, poised, her hair pulled back into a severe bun. Every detail about her was perfectly polished except for her eyes. Cold, calculating, disdainful. Sarah had encountered people like her before. The ones who didn't need to say anything out loud to make their thoughts clear. The kind of look that told her she was unwelcome, that her very presence was an inconvenience. She squared her shoulders and met the woman's gaze head-on. The flight attendant blinked slowly, a flicker of something passing through her expression. Was it annoyance? Before she turned and walked away, Sarah inhaled deeply. This was only the beginning. Sarah adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and made her way down the narrow airplane aisle. The weight of the stairs pressed against her, heavy and unmistakable. She was used to it, but that didn't make it any easier. Some passengers pretended not to notice, quickly averting their eyes when she passed. Others were less subtle, openly watching her with expressions that ranged from mild discomfort to outright judgment. She focused on one thing: finding her seat. The sooner she sat down, the sooner she could disappear into the background. Then, a sickly sweet voice cut through the cabin noise. "Oh, sweetheart, are you sure this is your seat?" Sarah stopped mid-step. She knew that voice, the same flight attendant from earlier. Sarah glanced down at her boarding pass. Yes, she was in the right place. She knew that, but the woman's tone made it sound like she wasn't. Like she couldn't be. She took a deep breath and met the flight attendant's gaze. Yes. 22B. The woman smiled, a small, controlled curve of the lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something else lurking beneath it. Something Sarah recognized instantly, satisfaction. She's enjoying this. Sarah's grip on her bag tightened. Around her, the air grew thick with unspoken tension. Passengers nearby pretended to be engrossed in their books or phones, but Sarah could feel their anticipation, like they were waiting to see what would happen next. The flight attendant tilted her head, feigning consideration. Well, if you need more space, I can try to find a more appropriate seat. She let the words hang in the air before adding, almost as an afterthought, of course, that comes at an additional cost. Sarah's stomach churned. She knew what this was. This wasn't an offer of help. It was an insult wrapped in faux politeness. A quiet, insidious way of telling her, you don't belong here. Heat crawled up Sarah's neck, embarrassment burning beneath her skin. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something, anything, but before she could, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. A man walking down the aisle, the same man from earlier. The one who had noticed her t-shirt in the terminal. He didn't say a word. Didn't even slow his stride. But his eyes flickered, just for a second, to the flight attendant, and something in his expression shifted. Then, he was gone, moving past her toward the front of the plane. Sarah exhaled, turning back to the flight attendant. She wouldn't let this woman see her falter. I'm fine with my seat, thank you, she said, her voice steady. Without waiting for a response, she stepped past the woman and into her row, but before she could sit, something else happened. The passenger next to her, a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a crisp button-down, looked up, hesitated for a moment, and then silently stood. Without a word, he moved to another row. Sarah swallowed hard. She refused to shrink. Refused to let this moment crush her, but even so, one cold, certain thought settled deep inside her. This wasn't over. Sarah lowered herself into her seat, forcing her breathing to remain steady. She wouldn't let them see her shaken. Wouldn't let them see how much it hurt. Beside her, the newly vacant seat seemed to scream its own accusation. The man who had been sitting there hadn't even tried to hide his discomfort. He had just left, as if her mere presence was unbearable. She clenched her fists in her lap. This wasn't new. She had spent years enduring the silent judgments, the quiet exclusions, the subtle ways people reminded her that she was an inconvenience. But somehow, it still stung. The flight attendant lingered for a moment longer, her smile unwavering. Then, as if satisfied, she turned and walked away. Sarah exhaled slowly, gripping the armrest. Just get through the flight. The passenger on the aisle seat, a young woman with dark hair tied in a messy bun, gave Sarah a fleeting glance before looking down at her phone. At least she hadn't moved. That was something. Sarah reached for her carry-on, preparing to stow it in the overhead compartment. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Her bag was slightly bulky, the space tight. But she had done this before. She adjusted the angle, tried lifting it again. It slid in halfway, then got stuck. Her face grew warm. She tried again, shifting her stance for better leverage. It moved an inch. Almost there. Before she could try once more, a shadow moved beside her. Need a hand? She turned. The man in the aisle seat, her new seatmate, was already reaching for the bag. He asked so casually, without hesitation, without condescension. Just a simple, straightforward offer. Sarah nodded, a flicker of relief passing through her. Yeah, thanks. Together, they adjusted the angle and, within seconds, the bag was securely in place. But before Sarah could even mutter another word of gratitude, a voice sliced through the moment like a cold blade. Let's just hope the compartment holds up. Silence. The words hadn't been loud, but they had been perfectly clear. Sarah stiffened. She turned her head. The flight attendant stood a few steps away, arms crossed, an almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corner of her lips. A cruel joke. One she had made loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. A ripple of discomfort spread through the row. No one spoke. No one defended her, but they had heard it. Sarah felt the sting of humiliation settle deep in her chest. The man beside her, the one who had just helped with her bag, exhaled sharply. His grip on the overhead bin tightened for a second before he gave the bag one final push until it clicked into place. There. His voice was noticeably stiffer now. He sat down without another word. Sarah did the same, pressing her hands against her lap to keep them from trembling. She wouldn't let this woman break her. The flight attendant lingered a moment longer, as if waiting for a reaction. When none came, She turned on her heel and strode down the aisle. Sarah forced herself to stare straight ahead. She could feel her seatmate shifting beside her, hesitating, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. He didn't, and he didn't need to. His actions had already spoken for him, but deep down, Sarah knew this wasn't over. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the flight attendant in the distance. Their eyes met, and then, the woman smiled, not a friendly smile. A small, knowing, dangerous smile, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah focused on the seat back in front of her, willing herself to disappear into the fabric of the airplane. The tension in the air was suffocating. Even though the flight attendant had walked away, Sarah could still feel the weight of her presence, like a shadow looming just beyond her vision. The hum of conversation around her blended into a meaningless blur, but underneath it all was a silence and unspoken awareness. People had heard it, they had witnessed everything, and yet, no one had spoken up. Sarah exhaled sharply, unclenching her fists. She wasn't going to let this ruin her. She had been through worse. She would endure this, just like she always had. Movement caught her attention. A man in a sleek gray suit approached her row, his boarding pass in hand. He hesitated. She recognized the look immediately. His eyes flicked between his ticket and the seat number above her row, then to Sarah herself. A flicker of hesitation. The smallest pause, then, ever so slightly, his posture shifted. His grip on his bag tightened. His jaw tensed. Sarah braced herself with a quiet sigh. He lowered himself into the seat next to hers, shifting awkwardly. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge her. He just sat her. Sarah turned her gaze forward again. She had been right. This flight wasn't going to be easy. A few minutes later, the flight attendant reappeared. She wasn't holding a tray this time or making any announcements. She was just standing there, near Sarah's row, wearing that same perfectly practiced smile. The gentleman next to you might want a bit more space, she mused, her voice light, almost playful. But let's see how this goes, shall we? Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what the woman was doing. The businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched against the armrest, but he said nothing, and the flight attendant let the moment stretch, letting her words sink in, planting the seed of discomfort. Then, satisfied, she walked away. Sarah gritted her teeth. She refused to let this woman win. This is wrong, a quiet voice murmured. Sarah blinked. It hadn't come from the businessman beside her. It had come from the young woman sitting in the aisle seat. Sarah turned slightly, just enough to see her. The woman looked hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should have said anything, but her dark eyes were locked on the flight attendant's retreating figure. Someone needs to do something, she whispered. Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't alone in this. But if that woman thought things had already been cruel enough, she was mistaken, because the worst was yet to come. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour when Sarah noticed the first sign that something was about to go terribly wrong. She wasn't imagining it. There was a shift in the flight attendant's demeanor. It was subtle at first. A change in the way she moved, the way she spoke to passengers. There was an ease to her now, a confidence that came from knowing she could get away with her behavior. Sarah saw it in the way she laughed a little too loudly with the other crew members. In the way she cast quick, knowing glances towards Sarah's row. Something was coming, and then, the final blow landed. The flight attendant approached Sarah's row, holding a tray with a meal. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Here's your special order." Sarah frowned. A special order? The woman tilted her head, feigning an exaggerated look of surprise. "You didn't request an extra meal?" She placed the tray down anyway. "Well, it's been specially prepared for you." A sick feeling curled in Sarah's stomach. This wasn't about food. It was about humiliation. Sarah glanced around. Other passengers were watching now. The businessman beside her turned his head slightly, visibly uncomfortable. The young woman in the aisle seat stiffened. The flight attendant's smile grew as Sarah could barely breathe, and then, just when she thought it couldn't get worse, "Well," the flight attendant said, stepping back, "if you don't want the extra meal, I can always redistribute it." She paused, her eyes flickering over Sarah's body, before adding in a saccharine tone, "Are you sure, sweetheart? You look like you need it." Silence. The entire plane heard it this time. Even the passengers who had pretended not to notice before were shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. The discomfort in the cabin became almost tangible. Sarah felt the words like a slap. A crushing wave of shame flooded through her. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't move, but before she could react, before she could say anything at all, a new voice shattered the tension that was completely unnecessary. Sarah's head snapped up. Of the young woman in the aisle seat, she was staring at the flight attendant, her expression set in quiet defiance. The flight attendant turned to her, momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me?" The young woman crossed her arms. she didn't order an extra meal. Everyone here knows that. Sarah felt something new mix with her embarrassment, relief. For the first time since boarding the plane, someone had spoken up, but the flight attendant merely raised an eyebrow, regaining her composure quickly. "Well," she said lightly, "if she doesn't want it, that's fine. Just thought I'd be accommodating." She took a step back, as if the conversation were over, but then, she tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with something cruel. "Though, really, are you sure? You look like you need it." Sarah's breath hitched, the entire plane fell into stunned silence. This time, there was no ignoring it. Passengers exchanged looks, some in shock, some in disgust. Even the businessman beside Sarah shifted uncomfortably. The flight attendant had gone too far, and she knew it, but before Sarah could find the words to respond, before she could even think, the airplane's PA system chimed. A deep, calm male voice echoed through the cabin. "What exactly is the problem here?" Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned her head, and there, standing in the aisle, staring directly at the flight attendant, was him, the man from earlier, the one who had noticed her t-shirt, the one who had overheard the flight attendant's first remarks, the one who had walked past without a word. But now, she saw who he really was. Keanu Reeves. The entire plane froze. Passengers inhaled sharply. Silence fell like a heavy curtain, and the flight attendant, who had up until now seemed untouchable, went pale. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. No one moved. No one spoke. The flight attendant, who had carried herself with such arrogance moments ago, suddenly looked as if the ground beneath her had vanished. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Keanu Reeves stood in the aisle, arms relaxed at his sides, but his presence was anything but casual. His sharp, focused gaze locked onto the flight attendant, waiting. Sarah could feel the shift in the air. The other passengers, previously silent, were now very much aware of what was happening. Some clutched their phones, others exchanged incredulous glances. "I asked," Keanu repeated, his voice steady but firm, "what exactly is the problem here?" The flight attendant blinked rapidly, scrambling for an answer. "Sir, I was just ensuring all passengers are comfortable." Her smile returned, but this time it wavered, fragile. "I was only trying to be accommodating." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "By humiliating her?" The question landed like a hammer. The flight attendant's face burned red. Sarah could barely process what was happening. She had spent years enduring quiet humiliation, learning to shrink herself to avoid conflict. And yet, here he was, one of the most famous actors in the world, calling it out in front of an entire plane. Keanu's gaze flicked towards Sarah. "Are you okay?" Sarah swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. The attention was overwhelming. Her emotions tangled together, gratitude, disbelief, embarrassment, but when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I'm fine." Keanu studied her for a moment, as if gauging whether she was telling the truth. Then, without looking away, he addressed the entire cabin. "Did anyone else think that was appropriate?" Silence. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between him and the flight attendant. Some people who had been pretending not to notice now looked ashamed. The flight attendant opened her mouth again, desperate to regain control. "Mr. Reeves, so now you recognize me?" Her jaw snapped shut. The entire plane was watching. Someone in the back was recording. Phones were being lifted discreetly, cameras pointed in their direction. Keanu exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is unbelievable." He turned towards Sarah again. "What seat are you in?" Sarah hesitated. 22B. Keanu nodded once. "Then there's been a mistake," he said simply. The flight attendant blinked. "Excuse me?" Keanu turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "I believe my seat is next to hers." A gasp rippled through the cabin. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The flight attendant looked like she had been slapped. "Sir, that's not." "It's settled." Keanu stepped back slightly, glancing towards Sarah with a small, reassuring nod. "Switch seats with me." Chaos erupted. Passengers whispered in shock, their voices blending into an indistinguishable hum. More phones appeared, capturing the moment. The businessman beside Sarah sat up straighter, clearly rattled. The flight attendant was completely cornered. If she refused, it would only escalate. Trembling, she forced a tight smile. "Of course, Mr. Reeves." Sarah couldn't believe it. Keanu Reeves, an A-list celebrity, had just publicly exposed a flight attendant's cruelty and, on top of that, had given up his first-class seat for her. Her hands trembled as she unbuckled her seatbelt. She hesitated. Keanu smiled, the tension softening slightly in his expression. You deserve better than this. Something inside her cracked, she nodded, slowly rising to her feet. As she stepped into the aisle, something incredible happened. Passengers, people who had moments ago sat in silence, began to clap. Sarah's throat tightened. Keanu stepped aside, allowing her to move toward the front of the plane, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The applause rippled through the cabin, hesitant at first, then growing louder. Sarah's face burned, not from humiliation this time, but from something entirely different, recognition. If for so long, she had endured the quiet shame of being treated like an inconvenience. But now, for the first time, she wasn't the one shrinking away. She walked slowly down the aisle, her legs unsteady. As she passed, some passengers gave her small nods, others murmured words of encouragement. A few even smiled. The flight attendants in the first-class section had been watching the entire scene unfold. Unlike their colleague, their expressions weren't filled with contempt, only mild surprise. One of them, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, quickly stepped forward to escort Sarah to her new seat. Welcome to first class, she said gently, gesturing toward the spacious, leather-upholstered seat. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before sinking into it. The difference was staggering. The seat was wide, comfortable, with ample legroom, so unlike the cramped space she had been bracing herself for. The armrests didn't dig into her sides. She could breathe for the first time since stepping onto the plane. She felt comfortable. She exhaled, pressing her fingers against the plush seat, trying to ground herself. This felt surreal. Had this really just happened? She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the cabin until she found him. Keanu had settled into her old seat, completely at ease despite the stunned whispers still circling around him. He caught her looking and gave a small nod, as if to say, everything's okay now. Sarah swallowed hard, then nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed, but the impact of what he had done sat heavy in her chest. She wasn't used to people stepping in for her. She wasn't used to winning. As the plane settled into cruising altitude, Sarah reached for her phone, her fingers still trembling. She had no idea that at the back of the plane, a video was already being uploaded to social media. A clip that would soon go viral. A clip that would change everything. Hours later, when the plane touched down and passengers began to disembark, Sarah could feel it before she even checked her phone. The shift. People were looking at her differently now, not with judgment, but with curiosity. At the arrival gate, a small group of passengers had gathered, their faces illuminated by their phone screens. She could hear snippets of conversation, disbelief, laughter, admiration. A chill ran down her spine. She unlocked her phone, her hands still slightly unsteady, and there it was, the video. It had already been shared thousands of times. She tapped the play button, her breath catching as she watched it unfold from an outsider's perspective. The flight attendant's smug remarks, the moment Keanu stepped in. The way the entire plane had shifted, the power dynamics flipping in an instant. She swallowed hard. Then, as if on cue, a notification popped up. A message to IT was short, simple, hope you're doing well. Keep spreading peace, love, and dogs. Sarah stared at the words for a long moment, her throat tight. Then, slowly, she smiled. The world had changed that day, and so had she.